Hello there and welcome to Third Spacing, where we discuss important issues on the peripheries of medicine. I'm Ting Hong and I'm joined today by Jaya, who is a Research and Advocacy Manager from the Humanitarian Organisation for Migrant Economics, or in short, HOME. Jaya, thanks so much for taking time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
So could you tell us a bit more about HOME and what is it that you stand for?
Okay, so HOME, we assist low-wage migrant workers in Singapore. So there are over 1 million of them in various sectors across the country, for example, construction, marine, process sectors. And we also assist migrant domestic workers who live and work in our households. Basically, we stand for welfare, empowerment and advocacy. So some of the services that we provide are, for example, direct casework services. So if migrant workers have salary issues, work injury issues, they can come to us and we will assist them through the process. We also have a shelter for migrant domestic workers. So for those who feel like they can no longer be in their employers' houses, they can come to us for a safe space, and we also journey with them through casework and provide them emotional and mental support as well. As my title suggests, advocacy is also a big part of our work. So we sort of bring to public consciousness some of the issues that migrant workers face, and we give recommendations as to how things can be better, because they contribute a lot to our economy and to our households. So it is to make sure that they have a basic standard of living and that they are treated with fairness.
What are some of the most common issues that you tend to encounter?
The issues that we faced with regard to them is, for example, a lot of them complain about overwork, verbal abuse, poor food that's given by the employer. For example, the food is insufficient, and a lot of times, they also wish to cook and access food of their own culture, but they're unable to do so. And of course, you have things like salary issues, where salaries are not paid on time. Sometimes they're also illegally deployed in that they are made to work in another household or in the employer's businesses, and these are prohibited.
What might you be able to provide for these migrant workers in the event that they approach you with such issues?
For example, if they give us a call on our helpline, we give them advice. We give them their options and what are the recourses available to them under the law. Sometimes we also offer to negotiate with their employers. It's one of the key issues actually that we face is domestic workers saying that they are unable to transfer employers because the employer has to give consent.
I see.
So we sometimes step into the mediation role and actually speak to the employers or to the agents, because the domestic worker might say, no, I'm too scared to do it. I don't know what to say. So we offer solutions in that respect. If a worker comes to our shelter, we normally provide casework assistance. So we refer cases to the authorities, be it for well-being issues and labour issues, to the Ministry of Manpower. And if there are more serious crimes such as physical and sexual abuse, we have to refer it to the police. We sort of explain to the worker what is going on, because a lot of them are unaware. We advise them on what their options are available to them. And we provide regular updates, because that is important to sort of keep their minds at ease also with what is going on in their cases.
You said that many of our domestic workers tend to be scared to report or to exert or to assert the rights that they may have against their employers. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Right. At the bottom line is that a lot of them come to Singapore to earn money for their families. So holding on to their jobs is very important to them. And because a lot of the power rests in the employer to repatriate them, to allow them to change employers, they're afraid that if they make a report or they complain about something against their employers, it just means that they lose their jobs and then they have to go back to their home countries. Another important facet of this is that many of them come here with debt, in that they have, borrowed money from agents or from family and friends back home. So in their first few months of work also, they are not actually earning anything. So to be sent back in that, or to lose their job while they're in that situation, is not something that they would ever want to be in, because it means more hardship for their families back home. This makes them very fearful of, reporting abuses or even asking for a change in their employment conditions. It could be even as simple as asking for more rest during the day or more rest days in the month.
because I'm aware that not everyone in our audience may be aware of the Singaporean context of domestic workers. So could you tell us how they end up saddled in debt even before they come into our country?
So usually in the migration process, there are agents back in the home country, and then there are agents in Singapore as well. So for example, training fees, passport fees, all that kind of pre-departure costs. And when they come to Singapore, usually there is a fee that is charged by the agency here for the administrative processing, or just a fee to place them with an employer. The law in Singapore is that they are not allowed to be charged more than 2 months for a 2-year work permit duration, right? So it's 1 month per year, So, but then some of them have 6 or 7 months of debt, and how is that possible? It's because the remainder of the debt goes back to the agent in the home country who has done all the pre-departure work for this worker.
It sounds like they are trapped in a very vulnerable place.
Absolutely.
The moment that they land in Singapore.
Yes.
And they don't have many means to escape out of this vulnerable position because of that power dynamic that exists.
Yes.
But if I may just present you with an alternate perspective,
yes.
I think some might hear this and say, well, I mean, we are paying these workers to work for us, right? We are giving them opportunities that they may never come across in their home countries. What's wrong with these arrangements?
So there is nothing wrong per se, for example, with the live-in arrangements or the work that they have to do. It's just that we must recognize there are inherent vulnerabilities sometimes in this kind of work, and putting a lot of power in employers' hands, because that in itself causes possible situations of abuse. In our advocacy work, it's sometimes recognizing what these situations are and giving recommendations to sort of reduce these chances of vulnerabilities for the domestic worker. We've also advocated for communication devices not to be confiscated, because sometimes that happens. So nowadays phones are so important, so for domestic workers to be able to hold on to a phone and make a phone call if she needs to. So that is where we are coming from.
The label foreign domestic workers is a bit oxymoronic in the sense that they are not totally foreign to Singapore, and yet they are not domestic enough to the point where we can say they are fully integrated in our society, right? And I was wondering whether this limbo that they straddle contributes to their lack of ability to stand up for themselves.
It's actually, I think you've raised quite a good point about how we view domestic work and therefore domestic workers. I hear a lot of employers saying, I treat my domestic worker like she's family. I mean, it's all well and good, because it means that comes from a position of care, of love. But that also comes with its own set of difficulties, because at the end of the day, this person is a worker. So when you say that, she's like family, she's a member of the household, it also means that sometimes you feel like you can take certain liberties, perhaps with a family member, that you would not with someone who's strictly an employee. And I'll give an example to this. We have now a mandatory rest day for domestic workers, as well as a weekly rest day that can be paid off, right? But what we have seen is even those who are given the rest days, sometimes they have to do some work before and after they come back from their rest days. Sometimes it is because the employer has told them, but a lot of times when I speak to employers, they also say it's because the worker herself feels this sense of responsibility towards the family to order to do this. So we're actually running a campaign, and I think this is a good opportunity for me to pitch this campaign, to state that a rest day should be 24 hours in law, because once it's in the law, it starts sinking into people's mindsets. She's then aware also that, oh wait, no, this is my rest day. I have a right to take 24 hours of rest, and I don't need to do anything for that one day, and my employer shouldn't make me do anything for that one day as well. As
you've mentioned, there is now one mandatory day off per month, which cannot be compensated by cash from the employers. There's also been a revamp of the 6 monthly medical examination that our domestic workers have to go through. In particular, their body mass index will be measured, and the doctor will have to report signs of abuse or unexplained injuries to the ministry. The ministry is also going to increase random house visits to 200 homes a month to check on the living conditions of domestic workers. Have they been sufficient in bringing about positive change for our domestic workers?
I think the measures are good in that it has given the domestic workers more touch points to give feedback and complaints and report any kinds of abuses or exploitative situations that they might be in, because it's a very different situation when an MOM officer comes to your house and asks you, hey, do you have anything to say? And then you're like, okay, finally, this is my chance. When previously you may be in two minds, you don't even want to reach out to a helpline, but if someone is there in front of you, then yes, it gives you more avenues to make complaints. But what we have heard also, they are still scared because it goes back to the same issue that I've talked about. If I complain, then my employer knows about it, and then nothing happens to her, but I'm the one who's sent back, right? Yeah. So I think these measures are good in that it will probably weed out the more egregious cases of abuse. If someone's really being physically abused in a person's home, for example, salary issues, I think those can be articulated. But for someone who wants to change employers because she's overworked, there's a lot of verbal abuse, or she's illegally deployed but she's not quite sure if that's against the law, she will still be like, what if I don't manage to get another job, or right, I still have to go back to the same employer and my employer knows of complaint about her, what then happens to the dynamic? So there are all these underlying tensions, I feel, that still exist, but the measures do go some way in giving a chance for domestic workers to at least voice some of their concerns.
My take on it is that they seem to be rather symptomatic in nature.
Right.
They give employers an incentive to guarantee the welfare of our domestic workers, yes, but it doesn't implement a mindset change,
yes,
to prevent such actions from occurring in the first place. It just punishes such actions.
I think you've hit the nail with the hammer, to be honest, because when we talk about abuse and when we talk about exploiting people vulnerable to us, why do we do it? Because we can. Because we do not see that person as worthy as you, right? So it goes back to my earlier point about how we view domestic work and domestic workers. I think one important point to also bring here is domestic workers are not included under the Employment Act. So, and the Employment Act is our primary labour legislation in Singapore. It basically limits working hours, it sort of calculates overtime pay, gives you annual leave, sick leave and all of that. So you and me, as I know, in the workforce, we will be entitled to all of this, but domestic workers are explicitly excluded. Right. And what's interesting is that when this has been debated in Parliament in the past, the response actually has been, it'll be difficult to include domestic workers under the Employment Act because of the unique nature of domestic work. Right. So that in itself shows the mindset we have as a society. If we don't view it as work that any other person does as an employee, then we give it less value. We give the people who do that kind of work less rights. And that goes exactly to what you said, it doesn't address the mindset. In Holmes' view, we need some of these fundamental changes, like putting them under the Employment Act, allowing them to change employers. They can't even change employers even after their work permit term is up. The employer still has to give consent. So if these are some of the issues that domestic workers have to overcome, then that also speaks to the kind of mindset that we have towards domestic work.
This mindset is one that contributes very strongly to the problem of domestic worker abuse. To discuss this topic, I want to highlight one landmark case. It's the case of Ms. Piang Ngai Don, who was a 24-year-old domestic worker from Myanmar who was chronically starved and abused by her employers until she succumbed to her malnutrition and injuries. And her weight, according to the coroner, was just 24 kilograms when she passed on, inclusive of the body bag. Now, what struck me about this case was not just severity of what was inflicted to her, but also the fact that just 2 months prior to her death, she had actually been to visit her family doctor, or rather the doctor of her employer. Now, during that session, the doctor noticed that she appeared to have some bruises around her eyes and cheeks, and the doctor in fact expressed an interest to pursue further investigations to determine the cause. But these injuries were brushed aside by her employer who was abusing her. First of all, what are your thoughts on this case? And could the family doctor have done anything different? Was she empowered to do anything different under the law to prevent this from happening?
This is the most abhorrent case of domestic worker abuse, at least in the last 10, 15 years or so. Even as all of us who've been working on very bad cases over the years, I think all of us were actually very personally affected by hearing what was going on, and also to remember that she left behind a very young son. It is saddening that it took this death to kind of implement some of the measures that we spoke about earlier. And as you said, what we should work towards is preventing, not addressing issues after the fact. With regards to your second question about the doctor, I mean, we don't have the full details of what the interactions were between the doctor, the employer, and the domestic worker. But what was, I think, a bit clear was that the employer was there, and you see that, I think, addresses the point of agency of domestic workers, right? A lot of times it's the employer acting almost as though they own the domestic worker, speaking for the domestic worker. And we see it all the time through our casework at home. We see how people feel like it's sufficient to speak to the employer with regards to the domestic worker and not to the domestic worker themselves. And, and that's why the move to remove the employer from the room and the doctor has to examine them is very important. I think you asked whether the doctor was empowered enough. I think she could have. Again, I don't know the full, details, but yes, I think if she felt like there was some suspicion of abuse happening with regards to the bruises and all of that, more could have been done. What is clear is that there could have been earlier intervention. Right. And the question is, did everyone look the other way because she was just a domestic worker?
If, let's say, a domestic worker walks into my clinic with, let's say, suspicious bruises around my eyes, what I'm taking away is that the first thing I should do is ensure that the employer is out of the room and to have a private and safe space for the domestic worker to confide in me. Yeah. Right. What else can I do beyond that? What's my next step?
I think what is still missing actually is centering the domestic worker, centering the potential victim. Because does the victim know she's going to be part of now a police investigation because the doctor is going to call the police? Does she know what a police investigation will entail? Does she speak English? Because there'll be so many conversations happening around her. If, let's say you as a doctor, you have this strong suspicion now that there is abuse happening and you're going to call the police. Is she aware? So I think there are all these gaps still because we sometimes forget that ultimately what's at the center of all of this is the victim. So actually in my informal conversations with doctors and all, I've said, you know what, pick up any helpline that will help domestic workers. It could be home, it could be someone else, and get a translator, someone who knows the issues, who knows the procedure, to speak to her in her own language. If you need to bring her to one of our drop-in centers, it might be tricky if the employer is there, but we can, depending on the case, we can sort of give that kind of advice so that someone can actually speak to her, advise her what's the full process, or we can speak to the doctor so that, the doctor can also somehow get that message across to the worker first, because not all of them would want to be part of a police investigation as well. So I think that is an important factor that should be at play at all of this. It's not just a ticking the box exercise. Okay, I've checked her BMI, I've checked this. Oh no, it looks suspicious. I'm going to call the police. But there is so much more at hand here because you are talking about a person's life. And sometimes all they want to do is to just get out of the abusive situation and go home or go to another. It's very complex. When an actual situation does arise, protocols can be put in place and they should be followed, but it really sometimes depends on very, very unique case circumstances. There are some very, very severe gaps in the system. I think while the current measures do go some way in addressing them, as you said, it's all quite symptomatic and we have to go a little deeper.
It's easy to talk about engendering a mindset change, but how exactly do we actually go about that, taking baby steps?
Right. I think incremental changes to law is one way. For example, 10 years ago when the rest day, the concept of the rest day was first put into law, which is that the one rest day a week, which can be compensated away, it came in 2013, I think. There was huge uproar and outcry and, oh my God, what's going to happen to my family and everything. And, my colleagues who were working on that campaign would say, there was, of course, a lot of backlash and everything. But now it's the law. And now no one questions it anymore. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, I mean, who can't get at least one rest day a week? But then again, there were some who didn't, right? Because, it could be compensated again. So now we have the mandatory rest day. So I think incremental changes to the law is one way because law changes mindsets. sometimes we do need more empathy as a society. We need to have a better practice of putting ourselves in the shoes of someone else who is more vulnerable and more marginalized, and which is why sometimes, when our caseworkers, when we speak to employers, we ask, can you imagine you wanting to quit your job and you're being told, no, you cannot. Can you imagine living with your employer for, 24/7? Can you imagine when you go to work, your employer says, please give me your phone. You're not allowed to use your phone. Are these situations that we would accept? And if the answer is no, then there is no reason why we should be imposing them on other people.
Now, I just want to bring us back into my clinic where I'm having a domestic worker with me.
Okay. Maybe I'll start with the insurance landscape. I
Okay.
think that's a good place to start. So right now, for hospitalization insurance, get hospitalization coverage of up to 60,000. Patient charges are to be borne by the employer. So here's where sometimes it gets a bit tricky, because sometimes a domestic worker has a flu or a cough, or she has a pain due to, doing work around the house, and it happens from time to time. But employers may be reluctant to take them to a clinic because, it means that they have to incur that cost, right? There are some insurance policies that offer the outpatient cost, but it's not mandatory. Their healthcare problems, I think, is as diverse as any other human beings,
Definitely, yeah.
So they do, get hospitalization coverage of up to 60,000 minimum. But what we see is that the employers are reluctant to even bring them to a hospital because they are afraid that the costs will shoot up. What happens usually is that they are repatriated very quickly. So, for example, if they have some kind of heavy bleeding, tell this to their employer. So the employer, instead of taking them to the hospital or taking them to the clinic, just repatriates them.
I see.
Yeah. So another big part of healthcare needs that we see is, there is a 6-monthly medical checkup, but they do not have regular health checkups. So what happens is that domestic workers, and we have seen this actually recently a couple of times, where domestic workers who have worked here for like 20 over years, they don't go for regular checkups. One day they find out they have cancer. Because there's no avenue for them to access breast cancer screening, cervical cancer screening. If you actually track these kind of GoFundMe, these fundraising pages, actually you see quite a number of employers raising funds on their domestic their domestic worker, because hospitalization fees these are good employers also who really want to help, and they've been with them for a very long time. But their hands are tied also. Apart from the cost perspective, there's the fact that there is not enough preventative health, for this group of people, right? Because they just continue working. They keep passing the 6 monthly, and then one fine day, I've heard of cases of domestic workers just collapsing. And they do laborious work, for many years. Domestic work is actually not easy to carry out on a day in, day out basis. I think when it comes to the healthcare needs of domestic workers, this is what we see. I think one last thing I'll say is that, because it is illegal for domestic workers to be pregnant, that aspect also is very much overlooked, because sometimes we've seen domestic workers who've tried to self-abort, take pills, and then they have to then be admitted for that kind of issues. But they are afraid to walk into a hospital or to a clinic to seek help. By and large, these are the kinds of issues that we see. We see sometimes occupational health problems, like come into contact with too much chemicals. Sometimes the employers want them to use very strong chemicals, and then they have rashes, they have eczema. Actually, a lot of the health issues that we see with domestic workers comes from the form of work they do, which is labor, carrying things. Then they have joint pains also, back pains, and all these kinds of things. Sometimes you have to carry elderly people. Increasingly, domestic workers are also undertaking elder care. Not all of them have the right training. Not all of them have the right mental health tools also given to them to cope with someone who's, for example, has dementia, is calling them names, is physically abusing them. But this is also a vulnerable person who's being taken care of. But our first line of defense is still domestic workers.
Right.
Because it's the cheapest option there. Through that, they also have a lot of mental health problems, as you mentioned. It's stressful.
I think there are those who might hear you and say that, well, in Singapore, our healthcare system is already very stretched, right? The cost of our resources is burgeoning, right? We have an aging population, rising burden of chronic disease. To what extent can we really extend the scope of our healthcare for medical workers?
And I think this is we see issues simply in silos, right? So if we are going to say that we need this group of people, we need migrant domestic workers for whatever reason, we still want them to play an important part in our elder care kind of regime and all of that, then we also have to be prepared to take care of them. You know, we cannot say that you come here, you work for us, but we're not going to give you the social support that every person needs. So I don't think that's a fair trade-off. Can't keep saving costs at the expense of the migrant workers. And that also includes a larger scrutiny of the elder care landscape, the healthcare landscape, and all these kinds of things. So it's not just this one issue alone. This brings me back to the first thing I said at the start of the podcast, which is that what we advocate for is for them to be given basic dignity and rights.
That's right. Would you say that overall, though, we are moving in a positive direction? Are you optimistic about the future of domestic workers and the discourse around them in Singapore?
I think so, because I think we see a lot of, especially younger people, starting to pick up on these issues. We are able to use social media much more as well. So I think people are also starting to be more aware. I think there have been a lot more things happening to sort of push things in the right direction, but change is slow. I think nothing can be foolproof, and that's where we sort of say that, these are the more pressing things that need to be addressed.
Right, so it's just about prioritizing the key issues that need to be addressed.
Yes.
I hear very strongly that advocacy spirit in you. What keeps you going in this profession? What has kept you going all these years?
The sense of community that the work has, because a lot of our work also involves direct contact with whether it's the domestic workers or the migrant workers, that keeps us going. And just seeing that there are many people out there that actually care, that actually are like-minded. And it's always so heartening when we see very young people reach out to us to say that they understand the issue and they want to do something. For all these reasons, I think we can move in the right direction. And I feel like change, even though it may be slow, will come. So that's what keeps me going.
So Jaya, you've shared so much with us today about the landscape of domestic workers in Singapore, and I just wanted to thank you for your expertise and for your time. Now, for those of us who might be interested to find out a bit more about HOME, how should they look for more information?
You can visit our website, www.home.org.sg, and we are on all the main social media pages. We are on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. You can look for home.migrants.sg. That is our handle for all our social media pages. So go and read things that we put out, our articles, our stories, our posts, to find out more about us.
To find out more on the topic of migrant workers, you can also check out our interview with Dr. Benjamin Kwan, who is the CEO and the former medical director of HealthServe. Okay. Thank you very much for your time today. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye-bye!